Hi, this is Archie. Welcome back to Archie en Route. We hope you enjoy this presentation, Basic Training in Locomotives. In this training presentation, we will cover 5 areas of knowledge: the advent and history of the locomotive, the iron horse, types of engines, famous engineers, and famous engines. So all aboard as we ride the rails of information. Tickets at the ready, please. The Industrial Revolution of the Victorian era brought about a mad rush of industry, and experimental steam engines soon found favour in the eyes of a once sceptical British government. The realisation that the horse and cart could no longer keep up with the demands of the new way of doing business opened the door to the advent of the steam-powered locomotive in the UK. Britain was leading the world during this age of industrialisation, and so it was fitting that they also led in the pioneering of steam. Many people began designing and developing locomotives and building vast networks of railways, bridges, and tunnels. But these projects weren't without their problems. Forging new paths for the railway was dangerous work. Gunpowder was routinely used to blow up hillsides and cut through mountains. Many railway workers, known as navvies, were killed in the construction of tunnels, bridges, and rail lines. In fact, the UK Railway Museum estimates that approximately 500 men per year died in the 1880s and 90s. These men were itinerant labourers who made their living moving from one place to another, residing in often squalid conditions. The navvy's hard way of living gave them a bad reputation among the middle and upper classes, and did little to esteem the railway. After the initial reluctance of high society, trains became an accepted mode of transport for all people living in the British Isles, thanks in part to Queen Victoria's approval of the rail system. Abroad, railways were thriving in the US, Germany, India, Russia, France, and Australia, opening the way for trade and tourism to flourish. From its inception in the 1830s, steam power dominated in Britain, reigning supreme for more than 100 years, though several competitors threw their hats into the ring. Motor cars, aeroplanes, and electric engines vied for power, trying their hardest to usurp King Steam's throne, but better designed engines saw Steam's rule remain intact. They named the decade from 1910 to 1920 the golden age of steam, with trains proving more popular than ever. But the 1920s were also great years for locomotives, with this decade producing some of the world's fastest steamies. Despite the large number of railways that were bombed and sabotaged during both the World War conflicts, steam trains remained a staple for the transport of soldiers and provisions to the fronts, as well as offering quick passage to many children seeking refuge from the fighting and unrest. However, in the 1950s, steam would find itself behind the times, and just like the horse, it too would be eclipsed by a more sufficient worker, the diesel locomotive. This new engine was far less expensive to run, was more fuel efficient, and had the added advantage of starting in seconds rather than the several hours it took to get a steam engine moving. In my opinion, though, diesel locomotives have never seemed as grand and noble as the steam engine, or indeed as a horse. Alas, the steam engine's day in the sun was over. The rise of diesel engines saw a slight fall in the popularity and general usage of rail, and a further hit to the industry would come from the least likely of places, the chairman of British Railways, Baron Dr. Richard Beeching. The aristocracy had always been somewhat opposed to the railways, and it seems that the same sentiment returned in the appointment of Beeching. It was his report in the 1960s, commonly known as the Beeching Axe, that led to the loss of many steam engines, some diesels, numerous branch lines, and even the main line. This was a brutal blow to the railway and to rail passengers all over Britain. The rail industry would never be the same. Considering there have been many grievous rail disasters throughout history, I must make mention of some of these lamentable tragedies that befell the railway, especially those occurring in its early years of operation. 1830. On opening day of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, a British MP was killed when a locomotive engine ran over his leg. This became the first widely reported death, even though a year prior another man had died in a similar way on this same railway line. 1840. A piece of cargo, made from cast iron, fell from a train wagon onto the rails of the Hull and Selby Railway, causing a derailment. 5 people were killed in this incident. It became the first rail accident to be formally investigated by Her Majesty's Rail Inspectorate, an organisation established in that same year to oversee safety on Britain's railways. 1847. A local passenger train travelling on the Chester and Holyhead Railway in Cheshire suffered a terrible fate when its carriages fell through the Dee River Bridge and into the water below. The bridge supports had been made out of cast iron, which was too weak and brittle to hold the weight of an engine. The accident resulted in 5 deaths and 9 serious injuries, drawing criticism of its designer Robert Stephenson. 1861. The Clayton Tunnel disaster was deemed the most tragic accident of its time. 3 northbound trains had departed Brighton Station just minutes apart, but due to a faulty signal and miscommunication between the south entrance and north entrance signalmen, the second and third trains collided inside the tunnel. The faulty signal was meant to stop the second train outside the tunnel to ensure that the first train went through successfully. The south signalman tried to stop the second train using a red flag without success. The north signalman reported that the first train had exited the tunnel, but the south signalman mistook this report to mean that the second train had gone through, and he thought the third train was safe to continue ahead. Unfortunately, the second train had begun reversing because of the south signalman trying to flag it down. The third train ploughed into the rear of the second, bringing about the loss of 23 lives and injury to over 175 passengers. 1889. Near Armagh, Ireland, a dreadful catastrophe claims the lives of 80 passengers and injured a further 262. It happened when a locomotive was ascending an incline, carrying a heavy excursion train of 15 carriages. Nearing the summit, the train was deemed too overweight for the locomotive, and so the decision was made to separate the carriages into 2 lots. The crew uncoupled the front 5 carriages from the remaining 10, putting sterns behind the rear carriage wheels as a buffer. When attempting to move the first carriages, a slight rollback of the locomotive occurred on takeoff, bumping the other 10 carriages. This was enough to send them over the stern buffers, back down the incline, and straight into another train climbing the hill behind the first train. To date, this is the worst ever rail disaster to happen in Ireland. It's all the more tragic to me, knowing that most of those passengers were children. Locomotives were affectionately known as iron horses because they came into being at a time when horses were almost exclusively used to pull freight cars and passenger trams. Although this nickname has all but died out, a few terms still overlap between the railway and the equestrian worlds to this day. Within the world of locomotives, there is a myriad of engine types. These include steam, diesel, diesel electric, diesel mechanical, diesel hydraulic, diesel steam, fireless, internal combustion, benzene, kerosene, petrol, petrol electric, petrol mechanical, and electric, along with a slew of others. We will examine the 2 most common, steam and diesel. Steam-powered locomotives are engines that use a coal-fed fire to heat up a boiler filled with water. Steam created within the boiler causes pressure to build up, sending the steam through a throttle valve located inside the dome of the boiler. The steam then travels through pipes to a pair of piston cylinders, each having a rod that attaches to the axle. The movement of the piston rod spins the axle, which turns the wheels. Steam engines can look very different from one another. Here are a few examples. A tender engine keeps its coal and water in a special wagon behind them called a tender. They are often used for long distance or express travel and to pull heavy goods or passenger trains. After around a 30-year pause in operation, tender engines have enjoyed a comeback in recent years, with a few engines now involved with mainline activities. A standard tank engine keeps its coal in a bunker at the rear of the cab and stores its water in tanks that sit on either side of the lower boiler. Though not widely used in modern days, standard tank engines can vary in size and are multi-purpose locomotives which can be found pulling freight, shunting trucks, or ferrying passengers. Because of their smaller boilers, these engines are quicker to heat up. Also, their smaller size overall means going in reverse is much safer than it is for a tender engine. A well tank engine keeps its coal in bunkers either side of the cab and stores its water in a tank housed beneath the engine. They are not widely used in the modern day, but were a multi-purpose engine when they were in widespread service. A saddle tank engine usually keeps its coal in a bunker at the rear of the cab or in a bunker between the cab and the tank. Its water is stored in a tank that straddles the boiler, like a saddle on a horse's back. Due to its small size, saddle tank engines were most commonly used to shunt trucks or to work in stone quarries. A pannier tank engine keeps its coal in a bunker at the rear of the cab and stores its water in tanks which sit on either side of the upper boiler. In the latter age of steam, these were some of the very best locomotives of Britain, carrying out a variety of different tasks. Sadly, they are not as commonly used in modern times, though you can still find a few engines operating special jaunts throughout Britain. By the late 1950s, diesel locomotives were widely used, utilizing four-stroke engines on a large scale, with 12 pistons to an engine. Four-stroke engines work by the up and down movement of the pistons, creating a repeated pattern of intake, compression, ignition, and exhaust. On the ignition stroke, which produces the power, the piston is forced down the cylinder due to the exploding air-fuel mixture. Some diesels employ up to 18 pistons per engine, depending on the type and size of the locomotive. The pistons connect to a crankshaft, which rotates to power an electric generator. In older diesel locomotives, which use DC traction, the generator sends direct current to traction motors located at either end of the locomotive. The traction motors turn the wheels, moving the train down the line. Nowadays, most of the new diesel engines work using an AC drive. An AC drive works by sending the traction alternator output, power in the form of alternating current, through a transformer which then relays the power to a rectifier. The rectifier converts the power to direct current and then feeds the DC to an inverter, reconverting it to AC. From the inverter, the AC powers the traction motors, which turn the wheels, moving the train down the lines. AC traction is said to be superior in efficiency than the older DC traction, as it is more dependable and the engine requires less maintenance. Smaller sized diesels do use the engine to directly power the wheels via a drive shaft, but larger engines are far more complex and often produce several thousand horsepower. This would be far too much for a mechanical drive shaft system to handle. This is a diagram showing the main parts of a DC drive diesel engine. It is interesting to note the sandboxes located at each end of the engine. These hold sand, which is sprayed onto the track so that the wheels can grip the line. The sand is not used all the time, but only when the engine is first taking off, when driving in wet or slippery conditions, or when negotiating gradients. The advent of the railway saw the rise of many engineers and designers, who remain famous to this day, despite some having died almost a century ago. Richard Trevithick was one such engineer. Born in 1771, Cornwall, England, Trevithick was a pioneer of steam, experimenting with high-pressure boilers and steam-powered public transport. As a child, Richard enjoyed watching the steam engines pumping water out of deep tin and copper mines near his home, and was greatly influenced by neighbour William Murdoch, innovator of steam, who experimented with steam-powered road vehicles. Surely, these encounters with steam inspired Trevithick's desire to experiment for himself. After the initial excitement over his inventions in Britain, interest waned, and in 1816, Trevithick ventured to South America to work in a silver mine. He was forced from the area by the Spanish army and travelled into Costa Rica to survey land for a potential railway line to help transport the silver. Unfortunately, the terrain wasn't suitable and two near-death experiences soured the trip. Trevithick returns to Cornwall penniless, to accusations of neglect of his wife and children. He died alone in 1833 from pneumonia. His third son, Francis, grew up to work for the London and North Western Railway as a civil engineer. He also designed locomotives, his most significant being the 422 Cornwall. Francis wrote and published a biography about his father in 1872. Born in 1781, Stephenson has the honour of being one of the chief pioneers of the rail industry in Britain, with his contributions shaping railways the world over. He is affectionately known as Father of Railways. At the grand opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, Stephenson's engine, Locomotion No. 1, pulled an 80-ton load of flour and coal, with a special passenger rail car attached to the rear to carry dignitaries. Locomotion No. 1 reached speeds of 39 kilometers per hour, a great feat for early locomotives. Stephenson drove Locomotion No. 1 for this significant occasion, which was fitting as he and his son helped to design and build the 40-kilometer stretch of rail. In 1829, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, with whom George had worked to build their line, announced a competition to find their chief engineer who'd be responsible for creating all their locomotives. The competition would become known as the Rainhill Trials. George and his son Robert entered their engine, Rocket. They had worked together to build Rocket between 1824 and 1827, and its presence and victory at the Rainhill Trials made it world famous. In fact, it was the only locomotive to successfully complete the 35-mile run. Neither of Stephenson's parents had been able to read or write, and they were very poor, so there was no money to send George to school. His achievements are all the more amazing when one considers that at 18 years old, Stephenson was completely illiterate. Possibly the most famous engineer of his time, Isambard Kingdom Brunel was born in 1806 to a French father and a British mother. And despite family money troubles, he received an excellent education, graduating from an illustrious French secondary school. His father was chief engineer of the Thames Tunnel development and employed the young Brunel as an assistant engineer on the project. It spanned several years, due to the dangerous and difficult work conditions, with Isambard himself being seriously injured in one of the two major incidences of flooding. These events severely hampered the progress of the tunnel. Brunel designed many dockyards and engineered the Great Western Railway, as well as numerous tunnels and bridges. He also designed several steamships along with a special prefabricated hospital, which was sent to Turkey during the Crimean War. This hospital replaced the hovel in which Florence Nightingale had been nursing. His son Isambard Brunel wrote a biography of Brunel in the late 1800s. Born in 1817, John Fowler was a civil engineer who designed the world's first underground railway system. It was, of course, London's Metropolitan Railway. Fowler applied the cut-and-cover method, commonly used in the engineering of tunnels. Fowler was engaged as an engineering specialist by multiple rail companies across the world, including in Australia. In the UK, he designed several bridges and viaducts, including Grosvenor Bridge, the first to cross the River Thames, Dollis Hill Viaduct, a brick structure with 13 arches, the highest point of the London Underground's above-ground line, as well as his most famous project, Forth Bridge, voted Scotland's greatest man-made wonder in 2016. Many of his constructions are still in use today. The A-Class 440 tank engines used in the Metro were designed by Fowler, remaining in service until the Metro lines were electrified in the early 1900s. Sir John Fowler received an honorary doctorate by the University of Edinburgh in 1890 for his work in engineering the Forth Bridge. He was also created a baronet upon the completion of the bridge. Born in 1876, Nigel Gresley was a well-known railway engineer, working almost exclusively for the Great Northern Railway and the London North Eastern Railway. In 1923, the British government's Railways Act went into effect, with around 120 railways amalgamating to form what was called the Big Four. GNR merged with other lines to join the LNER, and Gresley remains an employee of the company, eventually rising to Chief Mechanical Engineer. During his career, Gresley was responsible for the design and production of over 25 engines. These include the A4 Pacific class, a class of streamlined 462 locomotives, notably Mallard and Silver Link, of which the former still holds the world record for the fastest steam locomotive. Indeed, 4 of Sir Nigel Gresley's A4 Pacifics have held world speed records. In 1935, Gresley designed Silver Jubilee, named in honour of George V's 25th anniversary. He was knighted in 1936 by Edward VIII for his significant contributions to the railway. There are several world-famous locomotive engines, and I will share 5 with you, but before I do, you must understand something about engines' names. Many people make the mistake of saying the before the name of an engine, the Mallard. But the way an engine is named is the same as one would name a racehorse. For example, the first horse to win the Melbourne Cup was named Archer. We don't say the first horse to win the Melbourne Cup was the Archer. In the same way, if an engine is named Green Arrow, we would not say the Green Arrow. There is also a difference between an engine and a train. An engine pulls the train. The train itself is made up of coaches or trucks, which are referred to as rolling stock. A train too can have a name, but unlike an engine, the word "the" is routinely added as part of its name. The diesel locomotives which pull the garn do not have names. The garn refers only to the name of the train, and not to the engines themselves. Hypothetically, Green Arrow could pull the garn in place of its diesels. That being said, let's move on to our first famous engine, Flying Scotsman. Designed and produced by Sir Nigel Gresley in 1923, Flying Scotsman is a London and North Eastern Railway engine, built as a Class A1 462 tender engine. Flying Scotsman set 2 world records, one for the first officially recorded speed exceeding 100 miles per hour, and the second for the longest non-stop journey by steam, set in 1989 on its Australian tour. It is now retired from service and owned by the National Railway Museum, Britain. City of Truro was built in 1903 by the Great Western Railway, based on designs by a British engineer by the name of George Jackson Churchward, who was GWR's chief mechanical engineer from 1902 to 1922. It is a 440 City-class tender engine, and is credited by some as being the first engine to ever hit 100 miles per hour, with this speed recorded in 1904 by an English railway writer and recorder. It is retired from service and owned by the National Railway Museum, Britain. Big Boy doesn't refer to the name of one particular engine, but to a class of engines known as Union Pacific Big Boys, built by the American Locomotive Company. These are the largest engines in the world, with a wheel arrangement of 4884, and only 25 of these locomotives were ever built. They were manufactured during the Second World War, with just 8 engines surviving to the present day. The most well-known of these locomotives, numbered 4014, was restored to mainline service in 2019 for the Union Pacific Steam Program. However, the remaining 7 engines are on display in museums across the United States. In the mid-May of 1960, a Class A1X060 Terrier tank engine built in 1875 arrived at the Bluebell Railway. This engine was Stepney, and he became the first standard-gauge locomotive to run on the Heritage Line. Designed by the famous engineer William Stroudley for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, Stepney also worked for the Southern Railway, prior to being scrapped by British Railways in early May 1960. Entering the service of the Bluebell Railway was the saving of Stepney, and the Terrier tank remained active periodically until 2014. He is now on static display at the Bluebell Museum, awaiting parts and repairs. Thomas the Tank Engine may be the most famous locomotive on the planet. He began as a character in the 1940s, created by a man to amuse his little son who was sick with the measles. This man was the Reverend Wilbert Audrey, a Church of England priest whose love of the railway began when he himself was a little boy. His family lived near Box Tunnel, and late at night he would hear the coded whistles used by the heavy freight trains to communicate as they were going up the grade, assisted by a banking engine. These memories inspired the stories which would go on to delight children the world over, and the little blue painted 060 tank engine would chuff his way into the hearts of grown-ups too. I'm sure Reverend Audrey could never have imagined just how popular his simple bedside character would become. As you can almost certainly tell, I have a passion for locomotives, particularly steam engines. And although the knowledge I have is limited, I've enjoyed sharing some of what I do know in this slideshow. I'd like to see the day when steam engines could somehow make a comeback and once again rule the rails, roaming the world like wild horses. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Thanks for watching. God be with you and goodbye.